Hello, my name is Michael Dowd, and this is a 5-part video discussion course, the beta version, called God in Big History. Each of the 5 segments will be roughly 30 minutes long. I'll be inviting feedback during July and August of 2014, and then incorporating that feedback and any suggestions for improvement in a version that I will upload to YouTube in early September that is designed for both religious and secular study groups. And this beta version will be unedited, so you may hear me stumble on my words or whatever. The version that we upload in September will be professionally edited. Part 1 is titled The Big Picture. Part 2, Sacred Science. Part 3, Reality Rules. Part 4, Sin and Death. That is, what does science tell us about human nature and our mortality that's inspiring? And then part 5, Evidential Prophets. Now, there are many different ways to interpret big history. There's many different inspiring ways that people find to think about God and religion from a big history perspective. The perspective that I'm offering is factual faith or sacred realism. Some have called it spiritual naturalism or religious naturalism or inspiring naturalism. Basically, I'm a religious naturalist. I'm a Christian naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs at all. I interpret all mythic language as saying something real about this world, this universe, and our inner and outer nature. But like I say, this is only one way to interpret big history and to interpret God and religion from a big history perspective. I invite other approaches as well. In fact, many of my friends and colleagues have some form of supernatural or metaphysical beliefs, and they find most of them, virtually all of what I'm sharing in this series, inspiring. They just also have other stuff that they also find inspiring. There are 7 questions that this 5-part course seeks to address. Part 1 will deal with what is big history and why is it important, and how does a big history view of God and religion differ from other approaches? So that's what the big picture will deal with. Part 2, Sacred Science, deals with these 2 questions. What does big history reveal about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science? And how have our sources of knowledge and wisdom expanded through time? Part 3, what I'm calling Reality Rules, will deal with this question. What and where is God in big history, and why does it matter? Part 4, what I'm titling Sin and Death, how does a big history view of reality transform our understanding of human nature and death? And then the last segment, how does a factual view of God and revelation clarify our way into the future and call forth boldly pro-science prophetic speech? Now, if you're not sure that you're interested, or, this is roughly going to be 2.5 hours, you can watch my 18-minute TEDx talk that I just recently delivered in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The title is Reality, Reconciles, Science, and Religion. And there you'll get a good little 18-minute sort of overview of what I'm doing in this video series. In fact, virtually all the points that I make in that TEDx talk, I go into much more detail and offer much more evidence in this video series. Here are a few of the main points that I'll be making. A big history approach to reality synthesizes science and religion, head and heart, by transcending and including reason and faith, facts and values. Honoring both sides of the equation, how things are and which things matter, is essential for human survival. So I can't emphasize that too much, that this perspective that I'm offering isn't science and it isn't religion. It's a transcending and including synthesis vision that includes both, yet also transcends both. Big history is humanity's first and only creation story that's derived from global collective learning. And while it itself is secular, it nevertheless reveals a way of thinking and speaking about God and all gods that is undeniably and inescapably real. Now, I realize that's a bold claim that I'm making. I think I can justify it pretty strongly, and I've been presenting this in audiences all over North America. Words create worlds. In fact, this is the way I begin my TEDx talk. Words create worlds, and language changes over the centuries. In fact, what we call reality or nature, the ancients called God or the gods. And right relationship to reality is what ultimately matters for all species and always has. Now, whatever else we mean when we use language like right relationship to reality, it's got to include being in right relationship to this planet, to the air, the water, the soil, and the life of planet Earth. It's also got to include being in right relationship to future generations. And here I am with my granddaughter, Isla Renee. So I really dedicate this series to Isla Renee and to her grandchildren. Thomas Berry was my main mentor. He died just a few years ago. He called himself a geologian, not a theologian, but a geologian, kind of a theologian of the earth. He was one of the leading evolutionary and ecological theologians. And this quote will put this entire series in context. He says, "We're talking only to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers. We're not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism." Now, just a little background for those of you that are not familiar with my wife's and my itinerant ministry. Connie Barlow, my wife, is an acclaimed science writer. She's written 4 science books, From Gaia to Selfish Genes, selected writings in the life sciences, and Evolution Extended, Biological Debates on the Meaning of Life. Those are both MIT Press books. The Ghosts of Evolution was Amazon.com's top recommended science book for 3 months when it came out in 2001. And Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science, you could say the spirituality of science, is one of the leading books in religious naturalism. My background is in ministry. I pastored 3 Christian churches over the course of a decade, 3 United Church of Christ congregations, although I also had 1 foot in the Unitarian Universalist Association during that time. I've also done transformational education and sustainability education. I did that for 6 years. And I've written 2 books, Thank God for Evolution, my more recent book, and then Earth Spirit, which I wrote back in 1990. The subtitle of that one is A Handbook for Nurturing an Ecological Christianity. Subtitle of Thank God for Evolution is How the Marriage of Science and Religion Will Transform Your Life and Our World. Now, Connie and I have lived on the road, traveling all over North America since April of 2002. I don't know if you can see the side of our van there, but we've got the Jesus and Darwin fish kissing with hearts between them. It definitely gets us some interesting looks in conservative parts of the world. But it also has gotten us some interesting press. For example, here I am on Fox and Friends on Sunday morning. The New York Times Magazine did a feature article on my book 4 years ago. And it's interesting because even on Fox and Friends, as conservative as Fox News is, at the start of it, they were like, well, quite skeptical. And at the end of like 5 minutes, they were like, well, thank God for evolution. That's a book whose time has come. This is Fox News. My mother was watching it. We've spoken to nearly 2,000 groups. In fact, it may be over 2,000 groups by now over the last 12 years. And they break down into very, very different populations. I've spoken hundreds of times in every kind of Christian group you can imagine, liberal, conservative, evangelical, Catholic, Protestant. We've both spoken hundreds of times in secular groups and those that have a this world orientation, colleges and universities, hundreds of Unitarian Universalist churches, skeptic and free thinkers groups. I did a program 4 years ago at the United Nations. And I've also spoken hundreds of times in various New Thought, New Age, Integral, Institute of IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, various Eastern spirituality groups, Buddhist and Hindu groups. And even though these groups have radically different metaphysics and theologies, they all find the same sacred science, the same inspiring evidential worldview to work for them. So the perspective that I'm offering, I call Religion 3.0. Religion 1.0 is the authority of elders. Religion 2.0 is the authority of Scripture. Religion 3.0 is the authority of evidence, the authority of science. And what we're finding is that there are tens of millions, literally tens of millions of religious and secular people around the world for whom these two things are like the 2 commandments. Live in right relationship to reality. Then, of course, different religious traditions use different language, different sacred names for reality, and ensure a just and healthy future. And I've literally spoken in countless audiences that, from theist to atheist and everything in between. In fact, Connie and I coined our own sort of bridge-building middle term that can be pronounced either creatheist or creatheists. But obviously, supernaturalists and naturalists can align with those two sentiments, live in right relationship to reality and ensure a just and healthy future. Obviously, skeptics, humanists, and free thinkers align with that, but also moderate to liberals of every religious tradition that you can imagine practically also align with that. And I know that because I've spoken to all these groups. Each of these groups interpret the same facts of big history in their own unique and inspiring ways. And that's what's important. I'm going to come back to this again and again. What I'm offering is one way to interpret big history, one way to interpret God and religion from a big history perspective, but it's not the only way. What I'm calling Religion 3.0, I'm also calling the Evidential Reformation. That is where we see evidence as modern-day scripture and how that's transforming all the religions of the world as it has already transformed the secular world. And there are 6 main points that I'm finding are in agreement with the vast majority of people who identify with this sort of big history inspiring perspective. I sometimes refer to it as the prodigal species coming home. That is, humanity we've squandered our inheritance, we're waking up to our predicament, and we're coming home to reality. Reality is our God. Evidence is our scripture. Big history is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity, that is the practices of living in right relationship to reality, integrity is our salvation. And a just and healthy future is our mission. Now, obviously, secular people who are non-religious or anti-religious aren't going to find these religious terms necessarily useful. They may say it like reality is my ultimate concern. Reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the main way reality reveals itself, and so on. And religious people of various sorts might balk at sort of this saying the whole thing, and it said another way, that whatever we mean by God, it's got to include reality. Whatever we mean by scripture, it's got to include evidence, and so on. Now, I tested this out 4 years ago. I interviewed literally the top Catholics, the top Protestants, the top evangelicals, the most respected and esteemed theologians, scientists, ministers who fully embrace an ecological and an evolutionary worldview, including a couple Nobel Prize winners. In fact, let me just be silent. Just glance down this list. If you're a Christian, you're going to recognize a lot of these names. Now, what I found, and I tested this out in almost all the interviews, is that we all, no matter where we were coming from, I mean, we were all over the map theologically and metaphysically, and some of us were very conservative, some of us were very liberal, literally all over the map, but we all agreed on these 3 things. We all had deep time eyes. That is, we had an evolutionary understanding of reality that went both back millions and billions of years, but also went forward millions and billions of years. We all had a global heart and a global commitment. That is, we were all committed not just to our own soul salvation, but we were committed to the health and well-being of the larger body of life upon which we all depend. And we all valued evidence as, in some very real sense, divine communication, divine guidance, divine revelation. Some of us, like me, feel comfortable calling it modern-day scripture. Others didn't feel comfortable with that language, but we all valued evidence as divine communication. Now, I'm also in the process right now of interviewing it's like the who's who of major thinkers and writers and people involved, activists involved in both climate change and peak oil, as well as various forms of sustainability. And again, I'll be silent and just let you look over this list. And again, what I'm finding in my conversations with these people is that we all have this deep commitment to living in right relationship to reality and to ensuring a just and healthy future. So let's take a look. What is big history? Why is it important? And how does a big history view of God and religion differ from other approaches? Again, here, Thomas Berry, my main mentor, this quote just brings it into it. And if you're not familiar with Thomas Berry, 3 of his most famous books, he's written a number of others too. In fact, a few of them have been edited by Mary Evelyn Tucker. who's an amazing student of his and a scholar in her own right on ecology and the religions. But his three best known books are The Dream of the Earth, published in 1988, The Universe Story, which was co-authored with Brian Swim, another student of his and a major popularizer of his work, and The Great Work, Our Way into the Future. So here's a quote from Thomas Berry that brings us into what is big history and why is it important. For peoples generally, their story of the universe and the human role within the universe is their primary source of intelligibility and value. Only through this story of how the universe came to be in the beginning and how it came to be as it is does a person come to appreciate the meaning of life and derive the psychic energy needed to deal effectively with those crisis moments that occur in the life of the individual and in the life of the society. Such a story communicates the most sacred of mysteries, and not only interprets the past, it also guides and inspires our shaping of the future. That's the role of creation stories. Now, big history, which has also been called the epic of evolution or the universe story, one of the founders of the big history movement is David Christian. Now here David is delivering a TED Talk. You can see it's almost got 4 million views. The History of Our World in 18 Minutes. I highly recommend that TED Talk. In fact, David Christian did a big history course for the teaching company, the Great Courses. And Connie and I listened to the whole thing. And then we were so blown out of the water, we were so impressed that we then bought the DVDs and watched the whole thing. And both of us felt that it was the single most significant and inspiring educational experience that we've ever had in our lives. Well, what's exciting is when the richest man in the world agrees with you. Bill Gates said, "I'm a power consumer of instructional videos, DVDs, and downloads on a wide range of subjects. But my favorite course of all time is called Big History, taught by David Christian. I wish everyone could take this course." Big History literally tells the story of the universe from the very beginning to the complex societies we have today. It shows how everything is connected to everything else. It weaves together insights and evidence from astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, history, economics, and more. We are now making an online Big History curriculum freely available to high school students throughout the world. And that's what the Big History Project is. And there are very few things in the world that I'm more excited about than the Big History Project. What Big History focuses on are these thresholds of complexity. These greater spheres of interdependence and cooperation, to speak about it in human terms, but these thresholds of complexity over the course of 13.82 billion years of evolutionary history, cosmic evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our first and only globally produced, evidence-based creation story. And if you want to get a sense of how significant this discovery of time is, Pierre Desjardins said, "The movement into time is the most significant event in 2 million years of hominid intelligence." Stephen Toulmin said, "In the whole history of human thought, no transformation in human attitudes toward nature has been more profound than the change in perspective brought about by the discovery of the past." One of the key insights from Big History is this understanding that we are not separate from the universe. We are not separate from the earth. In fact, two of the major thinkers in the 20th century that furthered this, Pierre Desjardins, a Jesuit paleontologist and theologian, both a Catholic priest and a scientist, and Julian Huxley, one of the founders of the American Humanist Society. Now, here you've got a theist and an atheist that both share this same perspective, that we are the universe becoming conscious of itself, that we are nature uncovering its own nature. And even though one was a theist and one was an atheist in terms of traditional categories, they both shared very similar worldview. Way back 100 years before them, however, Percy Shelley, a poet, said, "I am the eye with which the universe beholds itself and knows it is divine." Carl Sagan concluded his Cosmos series with this quote. He says, "We are the local embodiment of a cosmos grown to self-awareness. We have begun to contemplate our origins, star stuff, pondering the stars." Brian Swim, as I mentioned, is a student and collaborator with Thomas Berry, and an amazing, inspiring scientist and professor of cosmology out in California. Here's one of my favorite quotes. In fact, he's got two fabulous quotes that just help people sort of just get this. He says, 4 billion years ago, Earth was molten rock, and now it sings opera. The Earth sings opera. Actually, let me go back, because the other quote from him that I really love, he says, here's the entire history of the universe summed up in 2 sentences. You take a great cloud of hydrogen gas and you just leave it alone, and it becomes rose bushes, giraffes, and human beings. I love it. See, Earth is our larger body. It's our larger self. I mean, when you get that, this picture isn't so much a picture of a human being looking at the Earth. I mean, obviously it is that. But when you look at how recently we emerged out of the body of life, or to use theological language, how recently God, reality, created us, we're talking about the last day of a 100-year process. If the whole history of the universe was compressed into 100 years, we're talking about December 31st of the 99th year is when God made us, or when we emerged out of the body of life. So from that vantage point, a human being out in space looking back at the Earth is not just a human being look at the Earth. It's like a piece. It's like the Earth has become complex enough that a piece of itself could get off of itself and look back at itself. It's like this is Earth looking in the mirror. Joanna Macy is another one of my mentors, and she's got this interesting quote. She says, this shift, the shift from thinking of ourselves as separate creatures that walk around on Earth in a universe, to thinking of ourselves as a mode of being of Earth, an expression of the universe. She said, this shift is essential to our survival because it can serve in lieu of morality and because moralizing is so ineffective. She says, sermons seldom hinder us from pursuing our self-interest. As a preacher, I'm telling you, I can preach till I'm blue in the face. I know people are going to do what's in their own perceived self-interest regardless of what comes from the pulpit. So Joanna Macy says, we need to be a little more enlightened about what our self-interest is. For example, it would never occur to me to say to you, don't cut off your leg. No, really, don't cut off your leg. Because your leg's a part of you, and you know it. Joanna Macy says, so are the trees in the Amazon basin. There are external lungs. And that's what we're waking up to, is that we are our world. That what we do to our world, we do to our larger body, we do to our larger self. Now, of course, this begs the question, what's our role in the body of life? Is it just to be good consumers? And that's what cancer does. I had a medical doctor that told me in layperson's terms that a cancer cell is a normal cell that gets, for a variety of reasons, gets cut off or disconnected from its genetic memory and starts thinking it's separate from the body and starts to consume the body of which it's a part. And of course, if cancer consumes enough of the body, it'll kill the body, but it kills itself. And then he asked this question, what do we call our society? Don't we call it a consumer society? What does to consume mean? It means to eat up. Why are we eating up the planet? Is it because we're bad, right, evil, rotten, crummy, sinful people? Or is it because, like the cancer, we thought we were separate from it? We thought our true home was somewhere else after we died. We didn't know that we were the earth, becoming aware of itself, becoming conscious of itself, that we are nature uncovering its own nature. And that understanding is like being reconnected to billions of years of divine wisdom, divine guidance, that we can become an immune system where we protect and foster and defend the health and the well-being of the larger body of life of which we're a part. In fact, I would argue that that is the only viable future for humanity, is where we protect and foster and defend this body of life of which we're a part and upon which we depend utterly. And this isn't some pipe dream. I mean, in the next 30 to 40 years, we will have the technology and the know-how to be able to deflect incoming intruders like asteroids and comets, things that have wreaked havoc on planet Earth and caused mass extinctions in the past. That's humanity beginning to become like an immune system. And this is a vision, in my experience, that young people can celebrate. Because as an environmental activist for many years, my message used to be, we're going to hell in a handbasket. We better get our stuff together quick or the whole thing's going down. Well, that doesn't inspire people, young people or anybody. But this vision, when I now speak to high school and college students and even grade school kids, and I say, humanity, you and your generation gets to help humanity become like an immune system. That's a vision of inspiration that many people do find empowering. In fact, Thomas Berry spoke of us, humanity that is, as celebrants, that we are celebrants of the universe story. Now, celebrants is a religious term. What does he mean by that? Well, think about it from the dinosaurs' perspective. I mean, the dinosaurs ruled the planet for over 200 million years. And yet their memory was lost 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit off the coast of Mexico. So their memory was completely lost until humans. I mean, we're the only, do you know any other animal that digs up dinosaur bones and builds monuments to dinosaurs? I mean, here Connie and I are clearly having way too much fun at the Sternberg Museum in Hays, Kansas. But that's what humanity is. We're the recovered memory of matter. We're the story remembering its story. So why call big history the great story? I mentioned that some people call it the epic of evolution. Connie's and my main website is thegreatstory.org. This gets us back to, how does a big history view of God and religion differ from other perspectives? Well, biologists Julian Huxley and Edward O. Wilson have called this story the epic of evolution. Aldo Leopold called it the Odyssey of life. Lauren Eiseley referred to it as the immense journey. Thomas Berry was the first one that coined it as the great story. Basically, the great story is quite simply the sacred story of everyone and everything. And no human story is left out. It includes all other stories, all other creation stories. So why call it the great story? And how does this perspective, a big history, an evidential understanding of God and religion, differ from other perspectives? Well, first of all, big history is a creation story that's not yet over. The creation of the world didn't occur just once upon a time in the distant past. Divine creation continues. Evolutionary change at all levels is ongoing, and we humans bear responsibility for how this story will continue on Earth. We are participants in an amazing, challenging adventure. This is a global perspective that's evidential. Obviously, all cultures, their creation stories drew on and built on their best evidential understanding of reality at that time. But those were regional perspectives. This is a global perspective that's grounded first and foremost in an evidential understanding of reality. Individuals from all cultures contribute to the great story, to big history. This scientific enterprise is global. You've got Christian scientists, Buddhist scientists, Hindu scientists, atheist scientists, scientists of all religious tradition and no religious tradition, and even anti-religious scientists that are all contributing to our best common understanding of what's real and what's important, or how things are and which things matter. I'll come back to that. This story, Big History, celebrates thresholds of complexity. There's a trajectory to cosmic, biological, and cultural evolution. It's not a one-way arrow. It's not without setbacks, for sure. But it celebrates these thresholds of complexity. It's open to multiple interpretations. In fact, it welcomes a multiplicity of interpretations. The great story not only tolerates these differences, it really does welcome them. The empirical and theoretical sciences and the search for material explanations of the world is the grounding. But when we venture into the realm of meaning, our diverse interpretations necessarily go beyond science. And so multiple interpretations are encouraged by great story enthusiasts. Like evolution itself, this cosmological story thrives on diversity. It marries science and inspiration. The great story weaves together science, religion, and the needs of today's world. Because the classical traditions, the great creation stories of the classical religions and native peoples emerged well before the revelatory nature of an evolutionary cosmos, these great stories, these earlier creation stories, can only fulfill their deep time potential if the ancient cosmologies are creatively interpreted to mesh with the fruits of today's science. In contrast, the great story, Big History, emerges out of the scientific awareness and thus evolves in step with the new discoveries and also the needs and challenges of our day. So it marries science and inspiration. It's a meta-religious synthesis. This is not a religious perspective in competition with other existing religious perspectives. It's meta-religious. The great story, it's not a new religion or anything else. It basically can nourish and feed and be integrated within any and all other religious and philosophical perspectives. In fact, I would say that the great story or Big History will fulfill its potential for humanity only when it is in fact taken in and absorbed independently by each faith tradition and worldview. Its gifts will manifest in distinct ways in different contexts. Again, there's no one way to interpret this. And finally, This is the story of the changing story. Whenever a new discovery is made, we don't have to say, oh no, how does this fit with, our traditional story? No, it's welcomed. It's the story of the changing story. Change is to be welcomed, not feared. Brian Swim said it this way: the new cosmic story emerging into human awareness overwhelms all previous conceptions of the universe for the simple reason that it draws them all into its comprehensive fullness. Who can learn what this means and remain calm? So, in conclusion, let me just cite some of the most widely recognized and valued resources within this big history movement. First of all, Metanexus is a fabulous source. Billy Grassi and the metanexus.net, I believe it is, Big History Project, and Chronozoom. Definitely check out Metanexus, the Big History Project I'll also mention, and Chronozoom is an amazing way to visualize big history. David Christian's TED Talk that I mentioned before, The History of the World in 18 Minutes. Definitely check that out, as well as Bob Bain's recent TEDx talk that he gave at the same conference that I was at just a month and a half ago. His TED Talk was called Connecting Kids to the Cosmos, and it's a fabulous overview of the Big History Project and what it offers education. David Christian, I mentioned his teaching company course. Connie and I both felt it was the single greatest educational experience we've ever had. It's 48 half-hour lectures. And Walter Alvarez, also, he and his father basically discovered how the dinosaurs died out. And he has a fabulous big history course that's also available up online for free on Vimeo. Actually, the teaching company course isn't available for free. But I will say this, that the teaching company every year, at least once or twice a year, they offer all their courses like for 70% off. And if you send them an email or call them, they'll let you know when it's on sale. So, a $500 course you can get for, 70, 80, 90 bucks. And so I definitely encourage you to do that because David Christian's course is priceless. Brian Swim, his Center for the Story of the Universe. He's got lots of great stuff that he's developed over the years, some of it in collaboration with Mary Evelyn Tucker, who I mentioned earlier. The two that I have found most inspiring and that, to my mind, are just absolute must experiences. The Canticle to the Cosmos, which is a 12-part, 12 like 50-minute segments. And his most recent thing is called The Journey of the Universe. I highly recommend both of those. The History of the World in 2 Hours is something that was just recently done. There's a movie, if you just put into Google, History of the World in 2 Hours. Actually, without the commercials, it's like, I think, an hour and 20 minutes or something like that. It's really well done. And then two of the best educational websites specifically for kids. I mean, there's lots of great stuff on both Connie's, my wife's main website, which is thegreatstory.org, and also Kathy Russell has a website called epicofevolution.com, and there's just great stuff for kids and families on both of those websites. Now, in terms of books, the most respected and best-known books, Maps of Time by David Christian is sort of one of the foundational, almost like a Bible in this movement. It's a pretty thick book, but it's well worth the read. This Fleeting World is just a little short paperback for high school students, and it's a fabulous little introduction to big history. Fred Spear has written a couple of books, but the one I've mentioned here is called Big History and the Future of Humanity. He's got some great stuff in there. Cynthia Stokes Brown, Big History, and then a textbook on big history. The one on the far left there, the bottom left, just came out recently with also Craig Benjamin is involved in that one. The last three on the bottom, The Universe Story, I mentioned before, this is sort of before big history as a term was being used, but it's a fabulous book. It's, I think, the only book I've ever read 4 times in my life. Eric Chasen, his book Epic of Evolution. And then, of course, Bill Bryson's New York Times best-selling book, A Short History of Nearly Everything. So those are some of the best books to consult in terms of big history. Here are some other books I recommend on this: The Trajectory of Big History and Its Significance. Robert Wright wrote a New York Times best-selling book called Non-Zero, The Logic of Human Destiny, where he talks about this trajectory of big history. Our dear friend Russ Genet has written a book called Humanity, Chimpanzees Who Would Be Ants, which is just it's just a short book, and he concludes with 4 possible scenarios. It's just a fabulous little introduction to big history. My wife Connie Barlow, I mentioned her book Evolution Extended. She shows that you can take the same facts, the same science, and interpret it in many different ways. And she has some of the best science writing of the last 150 years in there that she edits. A book that we're just now listening to on audio, The Story of Earth by Robert Hazen. And he's one of the big history professors, fabulous. We've watched 1 or 2 of his courses, and that book's also excellent. And then John Stewart, Evolution's Arrow, The Direction of Evolution and the Future of Humanity, where he talks about this greater complexity, interdependence, and cooperation, and what are some of the mechanisms that have led to that, and which gives us pretty clear guidance for moving forward. Now, in terms of deep time inspiration and empowerment, I highly recommend these books. Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston. In fact, that's our best-selling book as Connie and I travel North America. The Universe is a Green Dragon, which is probably more people attribute their awakening to big history and the Epic of Evolution and the New Cosmology to that little volume than anything else. Peter Corning is a fabulous writer. The Synergism Hypothesis is his. But this little short book, The Fair Society, is a fabulous and very practical book. Tom Atlee, Reflections on Evolutionary Activism. Essays, Poems, and Prayers from the Emerging Field of Sacred Social Change. If you're an activist or an inspiring activist, I can't recommend that book too highly. It is fabulous. And then my own book, Thank God for Evolution, I think one of the reasons why it was endorsed by 6 Nobel Prize-winning scientists as well as dozens of religious leaders across the spectrum is because it's giving voice not just to my views or Connie's and my views, but really to hundreds of scholars across the religious and philosophical spectrum, focusing on the sacred side of science, or the inspiring side, the empowering side of a deep time worldview. So just to recap what we covered here in this first episode, what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In part 2, we'll look at what does big history reveal about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how have our sources of knowledge and wisdom expanded through time. These are questions for reflection and discussion. If groups want to use this now, I'm not going to bother reading these. You can read them for yourself and pause them here if you're facilitating group discussion. And again, I invite feedback, radically honest feedback. If there's any way that you can think of that I can improve this, this is a beta version. I welcome that. And the final version, I'm also more than happy to respond to comments and questions raised by this video series. And there's my contact information.